The blade caught the light wrong. That was the first thing James noticed from the back of the amphitheater. Not the crowd, not the glass canopy that curved 60 feet overhead like a frozen wave, not the assembled forge masters of Vorthal arranged in concentric arcs with their ceremonial masks glowing in the dimness like embers in a draught. He noticed that the blade in Karnex's upper left hand was throwing light in two directions at once, and that the two directions didn't agree with each other. He took a bite of his sandwich. The peanut butter had gone stiff from the cold, and the bread had flattened on one side from being in his jacket pocket for 3 hours. It tasted fine. Below him, on the central platform, Master Karnex stood 8 feet tall and absolutely still. 4 arms, 2 crossed at the chest, the formal Vorthal posture for addressing an assembly of peers. 2 hanging at his sides, the lower left twitching once, very slightly, near the wrist. James had learned to watch that hand. It twitched when Karnex was working through something he couldn't categorize. The amphitheater held 400 forge masters, and not one of them made a sound. Karnex raised the blade. Kamurai, the fusion blade, the thing they had argued over and burned over, and rebuilt from scratch twice in a Minnesota backyard with a propane torch and a borrowed angle grinder. And he held it above his head with 2 hands so the glass canopy caught it, and the grain in the steel moved. Not reflected, not shimmered, moved, like water seen from underneath. I stood before this consortium 11 months ago, Karnex said, his voice layered in the harmonic double tone that Vorthal used for formal address, the lower register rumbling under the words like a second speaker talking behind the first. I told you that the methods of the Terran craftsmen were primitive, that their fire was too simple, their tools too crude, their patience accidental. 400 forge masters, not breathing. I was correct about the fire, Karnex said. The tools, the patience. He lowered the blade. I was wrong about what those things could make. He set Kamurai flat on the stone platform, and the grain in the steel kept moving, slow and dark and patient, the folded layers catching light in sequence the way a river catches morning sun, one ripple at a time. It is not an alloy, Karnex said. It is a bond. The chimes began. Not applause, Vorthal did not clap, but the resonance chimes set into the base of every seat in the amphitheater, all 400 of them ringing together in ascending tones, the sound building from a murmur into something that filled the glass canopy and bounced back down warm and layered and enormous. James stood in the shadows at the back of the hall and listened to 400 alien forge masters honor a blade made in a backyard in Minnesota with a propane torch and a borrowed angle grinder, and he thought, Dad is going to love this. He took another bite of his sandwich. Stay close, because the part that matters isn't the blade. It's how a guy with a peanut butter sandwich and no credentials got here in the first place. 11 months earlier, the shuttle smelled like recycled air and someone's old coffee, and James Aldrich was the only person on board who wasn't reviewing a data file. Dr. Solana sat 2 rows ahead of him, her posture perfect, even in zero-G restraints, going over the diplomatic brief for the 4th time since departure. She was the envoy lead, small, precise, the kind of person who pre-confirmed confirmations. She had spent 3 minutes at the boarding gate, making sure James understood his role on this mission, which was to observe and not speak unless directly addressed, and James had nodded and said, sure. And she had looked at him the way people look at a fire alarm they suspect is broken. The shuttle pilot hadn't said anything to anyone. That was fine. James respected that. Through the porthole to his left, the forge moon of Vorthal was coming up fast, a dark mass against the local star's amber light, its surface broken by veins of orange that pulsed slow and rhythmic, like something enormous breathing under the rock. The molten sky above it moved in slow arcs, plasma trails, bending around the moon's magnetic field in shapes that looked, from this distance, almost deliberate, like brushstrokes. James pressed his thumb into the corner of his sandwich wrapper to keep it from drifting. He'd packed 2, ate 1 on launch. The second one was for when things got interesting. He was the only person on the shuttle who wasn't a scientist, a diplomat, or a pilot. His credentials listed him as Cultural Liaison Support, Civilian Classification, which was a category that had been invented 4 days ago specifically to get him on the manifest. His actual qualification was that his father made knives in a backyard in Duluth and had been doing it for 31 years, and that James had grown up eating dinner next to a forge and could identify the temperature of burning steel by color from 20 feet away without thinking about it. Nobody on the shuttle knew that part. They thought he was there because Dr. Salana's department had run low on available staff. The shuttle banked, and Vorthal filled the porthole completely, close enough now to see the Forge Temple complex on the moon's northern face, a cluster of black stone structures that rose from the rock like teeth, connected by walkways that glowed faint amber from below, steam or plasma venting from joints in the rock. A platform at the summit of the largest tower that held what looked like an open crucible the size of a house. Fire in it that was the wrong color, too blue, too constant, not burning so much as being. Remarkable, Dr. Salana said to no one. James ate his sandwich. The Vorthal landing dock was cut directly into the rock, a pressurized cave with walls that had been polished until they reflected everything in dark amber. The shuttle, the diplomatic party, the two Forge apprentices standing at the entrance with their ceremonial masks in place and their lower arms folded against their torsos. The air tasted of minerals and something electric, a sharp, clean bite at the back of the throat that James recognized after a second. The smell of a forge that had been running for a very long time. Iron and heat, and the particular dryness that comes when metal has been worked in a closed space for years and years, and the walls themselves have absorbed it. He breathed it in. One of the apprentices, shorter, 3 of the 4 eyes tracking independently, made a sound that the translator rendered as, "The delegation of Terran scientific envoys is welcome to the Vorthal Forge Temple. Please observe silence in the primary galleries. Do not touch the cooling racks." Dr. Salana stepped forward. "We are honored to be received. We bring greetings from the Terran Alliance Diplomatic Council and look forward to the exchange of—" The apprentice had already turned and started walking. James followed at the back of the group, tilting his head back to look up at the ceiling of the dock, which was covered in glyph marks he couldn't read, cut deep into the stone and filled with something that glowed faintly orange. Old marks. The kind that get cut into rock when a civilization wants something to last past the people who made it. His father did that with the forge, carved the date of first lighting into the brick above the firebox door. 1993, in numbers worn down soft by 30 years of heat. The primary gallery opened around them like a held breath released. James had expected something industrial. What he got was something between a cathedral and a factory floor, and it was both things without apology. The ceiling was 60 feet up and black, hung with crystalline tools that orbited a central point slowly in anti-grav suspension. Hammers, tongs, dies of shapes he didn't recognize, all of them rotating at different speeds, so the whole assembly moved like a slow mechanical clock. Below them, on the floor, 3 forge stations were active. Open-hearth rigs with fires that burned in colors James had no names for, one of them violet at the base shading to near white at the top, one of them orange, but pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. Molten channels ran between the stations in cut stone grooves, fed from somewhere deeper in the complex, their surfaces perfectly still and mirror-bright. The scientists behind him stopped and stared. James stopped too, but he was looking at the apprentice working the violet fire, who was using a tool he didn't recognize to draw the metal in a long, slow pull. And the way she pulled, the angle of her wrist, the hesitation before the next stroke, was exactly the same hesitation his father made at the same point in a draw, and he felt something click into place low in his chest that he couldn't have explained to anyone on the shuttle. "The forge has been active for 900 years, the apprentice guide said, gesturing broadly. "This is the outer work floor. The eternal core chamber is not open to visitors." "Of course," Dr. Salana said. She was already taking notes. Master Karnex Vel will receive you in the display chamber, the guide said. Please follow. The display chamber was through a corridor carved from a single piece of the moon's obsidian rock, polished flat on all sides so that the walls showed the delegation's own reflections walking alongside them, distorted and dark. At the end of it, double doors, also obsidian, also polished, set with glowing Vorthal sigils in the center, swung open on their own as the group approached. Beyond them, a room designed to make you feel small and doing its job perfectly. Master Karnex Vel was already standing at the center of the chamber when they entered, which meant he had been standing there before they arrived, which meant he had calculated how long it would take them to walk from the dock and positioned himself so they would open the doors to find him waiting. James catalogued this without forming an opinion about it. It was a power move, the same as every power move, and it worked because the ceiling in this room was 20 feet higher than the gallery, and the floor was black stone, and Karnex was 8 feet tall with glowing vein lines across his carapace that pulsed once slowly when he saw them come in. 4 arms, the upper 2 at his sides, the lower 2 crossed at his abdomen, formal and deliberate. His mask, the warhammer-shaped ceremonial piece, broad at the top and narrow at the jaw, showed nothing of his face except the 4 eyes, each one pointing in a slightly different direction, the way the eyes of a creature do when it has evolved to watch for threats from every angle at once and never stopped. His voice, when he spoke, ran on 2 frequencies at once, the words on top, and underneath them a harmonic like a cello held at tension. Terran delegation, he said. You honor the Vorthal Forge Temple with your presence. We have prepared a demonstration of our highest craft. We ask only that you witness with the respect owed to 11 centuries of metallurgical tradition. Dr. Salana introduced herself and the delegation. She introduced James as cultural liaison support, civilian classification, and Karnex's eyes moved to him for just a moment, 2 of the 4, the front pair, and then moved away. James adjusted his translator unit. I'm going to smell like a lunchbox, he muttered, to no one, because the forge heat in the chamber had settled into his jacket and was drawing out the peanut butter. The scientist next to him, a materials specialist named Dr. Okaffer, who had been on 2 previous first contact missions, gave him a look of profound professional despair. Karnex moved to the display case at the room's far end. One of the apprentices flanked him, carrying a sealed container that was radiating faint heat through what looked like insulation that should have been more than enough to stop it. What you are about to see, Karnex said, has no equivalent in documented Terran metallurgical science. The Vorthal method of resonance forging under tidal plasma conditions produces a material that your instruments cannot fully classify. He opened the container himself, all 4 hands moving in a sequence that was clearly ceremonial, specific order, specific grip. We call it the impossible steel. It is the apex of 11 centuries of craft. He lifted the sheet from the case. It was roughly the size of a cutting board, maybe an inch thick, and it moved light the way water moves sound, not reflecting it, but carrying it, bending it in the surface of the metal in slow, traveling waves that had nothing to do with what the lights in the room were actually doing. The grain in it was visible from 10 feet away, layer over layer, each one catching the ambient glow from Karnex's vein lines and throwing it back transformed. Dr. Salana made a sound. Dr. Okaffer's data pad hit the floor. James tilted his head. The grain pattern ran in fluid dark lines across the surface, folded, layered, the complexity built up over what must have been hundreds of passes through heat and pressure. The surface had that particular depth that only came from repeated folding, the way a stack of paper gets dense when you fold it enough times, except this was steel, and the folds numbered in the hundreds, and each one was visible as a distinct layer in the pattern. He'd seen that pattern before. Specifically, he'd seen it on the cutting board in his father's kitchen, on the chef's knife his father had made on a Tuesday afternoon in October with a propane forge and a hand hammer, and a piece of bar stock from a steel supplier in Milwaukee, and had then left on a greasy shop towel on the kitchen counter to cool while he made chili. James looked at the impossible steel for another few seconds. "Kind of looks like Damascus," he said. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of a room where nothing is happening. The silence of a room where too many things are happening at once, and they are all happening inside people's heads. Dr. Salana's mouth had opened and closed twice. Dr. Okafor had picked up his data pad and was now holding it without looking at it. The two apprentices flanking Karnex had gone very still, the way animals go still when a sound doesn't match the environment. Karnex's lower left hand twitched. His four eyes converged, slowly, like gun turrets adjusting, until all of them were pointing at James Aldrich, who was standing at the back of the group in a denim jacket with a peanut butter stain near the second button, looking at the impossible steel the way a person looks at something they've seen before but can't immediately place. "Damascus," Karnex said. The translator rendered it flat, no inflection, the way it handled words it could process but not contextualize. "Explain." James looked up. "It's a folding technique. You layer steel, heat it, fold it, work it back down, do it again. Couple 100 times minimum if you want the grain to show up right. The pattern in your sheet there, see how the lines flow? That's folded steel. Damascus pattern." Karnex held the impossible steel at eye level and looked at it. Then he looked at James. Two eyes on the steel, two on James, each pair doing its own independent work. "This material," Karnex said, "was forged under tidal plasma shift conditions. Neutron brine immersion at phase 3 resonance. Anti-gravitic compression applied across 47 sequential passes. The method requires a forge complex of this scale and 11 centuries of accumulated technique." "Sure," James said. "My dad does his with propane and a hammer." Dr. Salana made a sound that was not a word. Karnex set the impossible steel back in its case with a care that was so precise it was almost violent. He closed the lid. He turned to the apprentices and said something in Vorthal that the translator didn't catch, too fast, too clipped. The apprentices left immediately. Then he turned back to James. "You will provide a sample," he said. It was not a question. James sent the transmission that evening from the Terran diplomatic suite, which was a set of rooms carved into the cooler side of the forge temple with air processors running at full capacity to bring the temperature down to something a human could sleep in. He sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and typed out a message to his father. "Hey, Dad, need you to send the chef's knife. The good one. Use the diplomatic courier channel. Dr. Salana will set it up. Don't ask questions yet." His father replied in 11 minutes. "Which one?" "The 8-inch. James, the Damascus one. The one from October." His father, "That's my kitchen knife." "James, I know. I'll explain later." His father, "Is this for that alien thing?" James, "Yes." His father, "Fine. I'm making a new one anyway. Don't let them keep it forever." The crate took 10 days to arrive through the diplomatic courier network, standard transit time, no way around it. Karnex did not ask about it again. He did not acknowledge its pending existence. He resumed his regular forge work, as though the conversation in the display chamber had not happened, and James watched him from the gallery observation deck every morning for an hour before the diplomatic schedule started, and tried to read what was happening behind the formal posture and the ceremonial mask and the harmonic voice. What he saw was a master craftsman going through the motions of mastery while thinking about something else entirely. The lower left hand, twitching at odd moments, not during work, during stillness. The crate arrived on a Thursday. Karnex had it in the analysis chamber within the hour. James sat in the observation alcove above the chamber, a slot in the wall that the forge temple used for apprentice observation, narrow and hot, smelling of the mineral bite of filtered air and old iron, and watched Karnex work. He ran 47 tests in 2 days. James counted. A scanner that looked like a tuning fork the size of a baseball bat, pressed flat to the blade's surface, and held for exactly 30 seconds each time. A second device that projected a field around the knife and mapped something, The readout showed patterns James couldn't read, but he could see from Karnx's posture each time the results came back that they were not matching what he expected. A third device that he built from scratch in the middle of the second day pulled components from a rack on the wall and assembled them without looking at instructions, with the precision of someone who has built things for so long that building is just thinking with their hands. That one he pressed directly to the grain of the blade, not the flat of it, at an angle, and the readout held him for a long time. On the second evening, Karnx disassembled the knife handle. James winced. His father's knife. 31 years of forge work in a plain walnut handle, now separated from its blade on an alien analysis table. But Karnx handled it carefully. More carefully, James thought, than the instruments required. The way he turned the blade under the light, slowly, at different angles, watching the grain shift, was not a scan. It was something else. It was looking. On the morning of the third day, Karnx came to the diplomatic suite. He stood in the doorway. James had been eating breakfast, powdered eggs that the Terran food processor made with resigned competence, and he put down his fork and waited. Karnx said one word, not in Vorthal, not in the harmonic register. In flat Terran standard, translated perfectly by his own unit, the way a person says a word they have been practicing. How? James pushed out the chair across from him. Karnx looked at the chair. It was built for a human. He sat down in it anyway, 4 limbs folding at angles the chair had not planned for, his upper pair of arms resting on the table edge. The pattern in your blade, he said, matches the resonance signature of our highest grade steel within a tolerance of 0.3%. My instruments cannot explain the mechanism. There is no plasma shift record, no resonance log, no brine solution trace. There is only, he paused, and the lower left hand came up to rest flat on the table, heat and repetition. Heat and repetition, James said. That's basically it. That is not sufficient. Tell that to the knife. Karnx looked at him. All 4 eyes, front-facing, which James had already learned was not the Vorthal default. That was the position they used for something they were taking seriously. James leaned back. Look, you're thinking about this like it's a formula, like there's a step you missed. There isn't. You heat the metal until it's the right color, not a number, a color. You learn what to look for, and then you hit it, and then you fold it, and then you do it again, and again, and again, a few hundred times. The grain builds up because the layers build up. It's not a resonance effect. It's just what happens when you put enough patient work into metal. He paused. My dad calls it listening to the steel. Karnx was quiet for a moment. Then, your father made this blade. On a Tuesday afternoon, he had a propane forge in the backyard and a piece of bar stock from a supplier in Milwaukee. Took him about 6 hours, plus overnight cool down. The lower left hand twitched. 6 hours, Karnx said. He's fast. When he started, it took 3 days. That was 30 years ago. Karnx stood up. He did it the way he did everything, specific, deliberate, each limb moving in a sequence that had a logic to it. He looked at James for another moment with the full front 4-eye attention. I require an apprenticeship, he said. James blinked. Sorry. With your father, I require instruction in this technique. I will travel to your world and undergo training in the Terran method of, he paused again, finding the word, listening. James looked at his powdered eggs. I have to call my dad, he said. His father's response, delivered via diplomatic channel 6 hours later. Sure, tell him to bring layers. Minnesota in February is not joking around. Karnx arrived in Duluth on a Tuesday in February, and the cold hit him like a wall. Not the temperature, his carapace handled cold well enough, the vein lines dimming slightly as they redirected heat inward. It was the quality of the cold. Vorthal was hot everywhere, always, the forge moon radiating from its core in all directions so that even the rock surface stayed warm underfoot. Minnesota in February was cold that moved. It had direction. It came off Lake Superior with intent, and it found the gaps between things and settled there. and KRNX stood outside the Duluth Municipal Spaceport for 40 seconds before he stepped back inside and asked a transit worker what the current temperature was. The transit worker told him. KRNX looked out through the glass doors at the low grey sky and the snow that was falling sideways. He squared his shoulders. He walked back out. James watched this from the pickup truck and said nothing. His father, Mike Aldrich, was in the driver's seat with his coffee. Mike was 58 years old, built like a man who had spent 30 years moving metal, with hands that were a size too large for the rest of him, and a way of looking at people that was less an assessment and more a simple recording of facts. He watched KRNX walk toward the truck through the snow, 8 feet tall, grey taupe carapace, ceremonial mask in place, and he said, "He's smaller than I expected." "Dad," James said. "I expected 9 feet. The video feed made him look 9 feet." KRNX folded himself into the truck bed, which James had cleared out and padded for the purpose, and they drove to the forge. The forge was in the backyard of the house James had grown up in, a covered workspace with a corrugated metal roof and 3 walls, open to the yard on the 4th side. The firebox was brick, hand-laid, with a date cut into the block above the door, 1993. The anvil was a 150-pound block of tool steel that had been in the same spot for so long it had left a permanent impression in the concrete. The tools hung on a pegboard on the rear wall, hammers in 3 weights, tongs, punches, a hardy tool, a set of files organized by cut. Everything well used, everything exactly where it had always been. KRNX stood in the entrance and looked at it. His vein lines pulsed once, slowly, the way they did when he was processing something. Mike came in behind him, set his coffee on the workbench shelf, and handed KRNX an apron. It was a forge apron, heavy leather, split down the middle for mobility, fire scored along both edges from decades of use. It was built for a man of average height, and it barely covered KRNX's torso. "Start by sweeping the floor," Mike said. He handed KRNX a broom. KRNX looked at the broom. The broom was a standard push broom, corn fiber bristles, wooden handle, 62 inches long, made in Ohio. "I am Vorthal Forge Prime," KRNX said. His translator delivered it in its usual flat register, which made it sound like a weather report. "I know," Mike said. "Floor's still dirty." James found something very interesting to look at on the pegboard. KRNX swept the floor. What followed was 3 weeks of comprehensive failure, and James recorded every minute of it because he had a feeling he would want the footage later. KRNX burned his first billet in 20 seconds, ran the propane too hot, didn't read the color, pulled the steel when it was too far gone, and it crumbled under the hammer. Mike said nothing, handed him another billet. He knocked over the near bench on day 3, miscalibrating the force he needed for a strike. All 4 arms and the instinct of 11 centuries of Vorthal forge training went into that hammer swing, and it went through the metal, through the anvil face, and into the bench beyond. Mike examined the bench, said ham, got a new bench from the garage. He melted a billet on day 7, genuinely melted it, overread the color on a low-light afternoon, and went 15 seconds past the point of no return. It pooled. KRNX looked at it for a moment, then looked at Mike, then looked at the pooled steel. "You read orange as forge ready," Mike said. "For our steel, orange means you already missed it. Watch for the dark. The color before orange. Like the sky 10 minutes after sunset, you know it when you see it. You have to learn it, though. You can't calculate it." KRNX's lower left hand was twitching continuously by this point, which James had started to understand was not confusion, but something closer to recalibration. The hand that twitched when the categories weren't working. On day 14, KRNX inhaled forge fumes. A shift in wind direction, an unexpected backdraft through the open wall, and a concentrated pocket of propane combustion products hit him at the wrong angle. He went down in 3 seconds, all 4 limbs folding in the Vorthal involuntary collapse pattern, which looked alarming until James confirmed that his vein lines were still pulsing, and his breathing, though changed in rhythm. was steady. They got him inside. The Terran medic on standby, Dr. Salana, had insisted on one, and for once James had agreed with her, confirmed he was stable, but needed to clear the compounds from his system. Vorthal carapace filtered most environmental toxins well, but propane combustion byproducts were not in its catalogue. 3 weeks, the medic said. Kaarnex came back on a Wednesday morning in March, 3 weeks and 2 days after he'd gone down, and the snow was starting to thin at the edges of the yard. He walked into the forge, put on the apron. Mike had gotten him a proper one, extended to fit, same leather, same fire-scoring pattern, and picked up the broom. The floor was already clean. He swept it anyway. Mike watched from the workbench. He didn't say anything. He picked up his coffee, which was cold by now, and drank it cold. Then he set down the mug, stood up and said, "Okay, today we talk about color." 3 more weeks after that, something shifted. James saw it happen, though he couldn't have said exactly when. It was the kind of change that accumulates in increments until suddenly the increments have added up to something different. Kaarnex stopped calculating his strikes and started landing them. The timing changed first. He'd been hitting at a count, a precise interval he'd worked out from observational data, and then one afternoon he stopped counting and just hit, and the hit was right. Then the color reading. Then the fold. One morning Mike watched Kaarnex pull a piece of steel from the fire at exactly the right moment, set it on the anvil, and work it through a full fold sequence without stopping, the motion continuous and correct, and reading off nothing but the metal itself. And Mike put down his coffee and said, "There you go." Kaarnex looked at the fold. "Sensei," he said. Mike looked at him, then he picked up his coffee again. "Don't push it," he said. But he was smiling. The twin hearth was Kaarnex's idea, and it almost burned the backyard down. Not metaphorically, Mike had to get the hose. It started 3 days after the breakthrough fold, when Kaarnex showed up at the forge before Mike was awake, and had already sketched a design in the dirt of the yard with a stick. A modified forge configuration that combined the propane firebox with a secondary resonance chamber he wanted to build from components he'd had shipped from Vorthal. The sketch was 12 feet long and involved a heat-trouting system that Kaarnex had worked out from memory, annotated in Vorthal script along the edges with what James' translator rendered as calibration notes, and this part is very important. Mike came out in his work boots with coffee, looked at the sketch for a while, and said, "You want to put a quantum resonance chamber next to my propane firebox. The resonance frequency of Vorthal forge technique requires. In my backyard, the output will be. In Minnesota." Kaarnex's lower left hand twitched. "The structural integration is sound. I have reviewed the thermal tolerances. The combination of direct heat forging and resonance compression should produce a steel with properties neither method achieves independently. A fusion." Mike drank his coffee. He looked at the sketch again. He crouched down and traced one section of it with his finger, following the heat-trouting lines. "This part," he said, pointing, "where the propane exhaust runs next to the resonance intake. You've got them sharing a wall. The insulation will be. That's going to vent wrong." Kaarnex looked at the sketch. His 4 eyes moved across it in the independent way they had, each one checking a different section, the visual processing running parallel. Then 3 of them converged on the section Mike had pointed to. The lower left hand twitched. "You are correct," Kaarnex said. "Move the intake 6 inches left. Run the exhaust over the top, not alongside." Kaarnex crouched, the full 8 feet of him folding down to Mike's level, which put his mask about a foot from Mike's face, and redrew the section in the dirt. Mike studied it. Better. They built it over 2 weeks. Mike supplied the propane infrastructure and the knowledge of where the county fire code drew its lines. Kaarnex supplied the resonance components, which arrived in 3 crates from Vorthal and included one piece, a lens-shaped component about the size of a dinner plate, that glowed faint violet when unpacked and kept glowing for 4 days without any power source, which Mike examined from several angles before deciding it was probably fine. The first test fire of the twin hearth ran too hot. The resonance chamber amplified the propane heat in a frequency interaction neither of them had fully calculated, and the temperature at the forge face spiked past anything the thermocouple was rated for. It just read error in block letters, and the wood of the near bench caught. Mike got the hose. Kayanek stood in the smoke and looked at the twin hearth with an expression James had learned to read, not defeat, but active revision. His upper arms were at his sides. His lower arms were crossed. He was working. The resonance frequency needs to step down, Mike said, coiling the hose. You're amplifying everything. You want to shape the heat, not double it. A modulation damper, Kayanek said, applied at the intake stage. Whatever you want to call it. In Vorthal forge tradition, this component is called. He said a word that the translator rendered as the thing that tells the fire to be quieter. Mike looked at him. I like that, Mike said. The second test fire worked. The heat at the forge face was unlike anything either of them had produced separately. Not hotter, exactly, but more consistent, more even, the temperature holding steady in a range that was easy to work in. The steel responded differently, moved more willingly under the hammer, folded with less force. The grain built up faster, denser, the layers compressing into each other with a clarity that showed in the surface finish. Each fold visible, each one distinct, the pattern running deeper than either propane or resonance alone could manage. Mike worked a test piece for an hour. He pulled it, folded it, worked it back, folded it again. He didn't say anything for most of it. At the end, he set it on the cooling rack and looked at Karnex. Yeah, he said. Okay. Kamurai came from an argument. Karnex wanted to start with a high-carbon bar and fold in a Nikolaian alloy from the Vorthal shipment at the 7th pass, which would give the finished blade a hardness he could calculate to the precise Rockwell number. Mike wanted to start with 2 pieces of carbon steel from different sources and weld them at the fire before the first fold, because the carbon variation would show in the grain and the pattern would be better. The structural integrity, Karnex started. The pattern, Mike said, is an aesthetic consideration. Is the point. They went back and forth for 2 days. Not angrily, it was more like 2 people comparing maps of the same territory that had been drawn from different starting positions. Karnex's arguments were precise and numerically supported. Mike's arguments were direct and based on 31 years of watching steel do what steel does. James stayed out of it. He ate his sandwich. He watched. On the 3rd day, Karnex came into the forge in the morning and said, "We will use your starting method and my alloy at the 7th pass." Mike said, "Fine." Karnex said, "The structural integrity will be optimal and the pattern will be better." Mike said, "I know." They started that morning. The billet went into the twin hearth at 7:15, and they pulled it at 7:42, and the color was exactly right. The dark that Mike had described weeks ago, the sky 10 minutes after sunset, that particular shade of deep orange red that meant the steel was ready and not a second over. Karnex read it without hesitating. He called it before Mike did. Mike said nothing, but he nodded. The fold sequence took most of the day. They worked in shifts, one at the hammer, one at the fire, and the blade grew from billet to rough shape across a series of passes that James lost count of somewhere past the 200th. The Vorthal alloy went in at the 7th pass exactly as planned, and the moment it integrated into the fold sequence, the grain in the steel changed, deepened, the pattern shifting from the regular Damascus wave into something that moved differently, the layers intersecting at angles that seemed almost 3-dimensional, depth in a flat surface. They stopped at dusk. The rough blade sat on the cooling rack and threw the last light of the day back at them from a pattern that neither of them had made alone. "Tomorrow," Mike said. "Tomorrow," Karnex agreed. It took 3 more weeks. Grinding, fitting, heat treatment, the quench, which Karnex watched with an intensity that would have been alarming if James hadn't known by now that Karnex watched everything that mattered with that same locked-on focus. The handle came from a piece of stabilized walnut that Mike had been keeping in the shop for 2 years, waiting for the right blade. He hadn't said that when he brought it out. He just set it on the bench. Karnex looked at it for a moment. "Walnut," he said. "Good grain, holds well." Mike picked it up and sighted down the length of it, warm in the hand. Vorthal handle material is typically resonance crystalline composite. Cold in the hand. Karnex considered. Yes. Walnut, Mike said. He set it back down. The finished blade was 10 inches, single bevel. The pattern in the steel ran from the spine to the edge in a wave that shifted at the alloy integration point. The Damascus grain flowing into something richer, more complex, the Vorthal contribution visible as a deeper current running through the folded layers like a river inside a river. It was not the longest blade either of them had made. It was not the most technically demanding. But it was the first one that neither of them could have made without the other, and that was visible in it, the way a conversation is visible in a room after the people who had it have left. Mike held it, turned it in the light, handed it to Karnex. Karnex held it with his lower 2 hands, the careful grip, not the working grip. He looked at the pattern. "What do we call it?" James asked from the corner. Mike and Karnex looked at each other. "Samurai," Karnex said. Mike said, "What's that mean?" In Vorthal, it is the word for the moment when 2 forge fires meet without either one going out. Mike thought about that. "Good name," he said. The contest entry was James' idea, and both of them thought it was a bad one. The Great Lakes Regional Blade and Edge show ran out of a converted shipping hangar in Duluth every March. 112 exhibitors, 2 competition categories, judges who had been doing this for decades and had strong opinions about everything. It was not an international event. It was not a prestigious event in any sense that would register to the Vorthal Forge Consortium. It was a regional show in a cold hangar next to Lake Superior where Mike had entered 7 times and placed 4, and where the competition would include production knives and hand-forged blades and exactly 0 pieces of alien-human fusion metallurgy. "They won't know what to do with it," Mike said. "They'll put it in the wrong category," Karnex said. "They will definitely put it in the wrong category," Mike agreed. "It'll be fine," James said. "Enter it anyway." Mike and Karnex looked at each other again. James had started to notice they did this, checked each other's read on a situation the way forge partners check a weld, quick and practiced, and without making a thing of it. "We can enter it as open class," Mike said. "No category restriction." "And if they do not know how to judge it?" Karnex asked. "Then they figure it out," James said. "That's kind of the point." The hangar was cold the morning of the show, Lake Superior throwing its February presence through the walls in a way that all the space heaters along the perimeter couldn't quite fix. Tables ran in long rows under fluorescent lights, every blade laid out on its display cloth, the makers standing behind them in the patient way of people who have made something and are willing to let it be seen. Mike set up the table. Black suede cloth, no frame, no placard beyond the entry tag. Samurai rested flat on the cloth and caught the fluorescent light in 2 directions at once, the way the impossible steel had caught the light in the display chamber on Vorthal, light going somewhere it shouldn't, the grain making choices of its own. Karnex stood behind the table. His ceremonial mask was in place. He was 8 feet tall. He was, at this moment, the only Vorthal in the state of Minnesota, possibly in the northern hemisphere. The people walking the aisle slowed when they passed the table. Not because of Karnex, though that was part of it, because of the blade. A woman in her 60s stopped completely, a maker, from the calluses on her hands and the way she looked at the steel, head tilted, not looking at the surface but into it. She leaned forward without touching the cloth. "Is that Damascus?" "And something else," Mike said. She straightened up and looked at Karnex, looked at the blade, looked at Mike. What's the something else? That, Karnex said, is a longer story. She smiled. I've got time. The first judge came by at 10. The second at 11:15. The third spent 7 minutes at the table and left without writing anything down, which usually meant trouble, but sometimes meant the opposite of trouble. Mike drank his coffee. It was cold. Karnex's 4 eyes tracked the judging panel across the room as they moved from table to table. His lower left hand was still, not twitching, just resting at his side. James had not seen that hand fully still since Duluth. "You're not nervous," James said. Karnex turned 2 eyes toward him. "The blade is what it is. The judge's categories do not change what it is." "That's very calm of you." "I am 3-4 determined," Karnex said. "The remaining quarter is aware of possible outcomes." James looked at him. "Did you just make a joke?" "I have been in Minnesota for 4 months," Karnex said. "Some things transfer." The hangar went quiet around them, the specific quiet of a room full of people waiting for something they care about. Lake Superior pressed against the walls with its particular grey silence. Somewhere near the back, a space heater clicked and ran. Mike set down his cold coffee. He had not said much all morning, which was not unusual. Mike communicated primarily in coffee and nods, and the occasional declarative statement that landed like a nail going in straight. But there was a quality to his quiet now that James recognized from the forge. The quality of a person watching something they've made go out into the world. Karnex was looking at the blade. Not at the room, not at the judges, not at the crowd of makers and enthusiasts moving through the aisle. At the blade. His lower 2 hands rested behind his back in the formal Vorthal rest position, and his vein lines pulsed once, slowly. James thought, he's already back in the snow, under the awning, learning to read the color. Then the announcement board at the front of the hangar lit up, and the room went quieter than it had been all morning. And here was the thing nobody had planned for. Samurai had not been entered in one category. It had been entered in open class, which the judges had apparently decided to interpret as all 3 of the show's primary competition categories simultaneously, because they didn't have a box for what it was, so they put it in all of them. Best pattern weld, best fit and finish, best in show, open division. 3 categories. 3 lines on the board, same entry number. Mike stared at the board. He picked up his cold coffee and drank it without noticing it was cold. But it was the 4th line on the board, the one James saw when he looked up from checking the entry number twice, that stopped everything. Below the 3 category wins, in a font size the board didn't usually use, were 6 words that had not been on any category list in the show's 40-year history. Special recognition, technique documentation required. Karnex read it. His lower left hand came up from behind his back and rested flat at his side, still. "What does that mean?" James asked a woman near them who had been coming to this show for 20 years. She looked at the board, looked at the blade, looked at Karnex. "It means," she said slowly, "that they want to know how you made it, and they want it on record, because they've never seen anything like it, and they're not willing to just let that walk out the door." Karnex turned to Mike. Mike turned to Karnex. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Mike said, quietly, "You're going to have to teach them." And Karnex, for the first time in 4 months of forge work and failed billets and cold mornings and a hospital bed and 3 weeks of recovery and every argument about steel composition and every silent hour at the anvil, Karnex smiled. James saw it because he was watching. It was a small thing, a shift in the muscle around the lower eyes, the mask hiding most of it, but it was there. "Yes," Karnex said, "I suppose I am." The drive back from Duluth was quiet in the way that follows something large. Mike drove. Karnex was in the truck bed again, limbs folded, the ceremonial mask off for the first time James could remember, set beside him on the padded floor, face up, the Warhammer shape catching the highway light as it passed. Without it, Karnex's face was less alien than James expected, more specific. The four eyes half closed, not in sleep, but in the mode James now recognized as deep processing, the Vorthal equivalent of staring at the ceiling. In the front seat, Mike had his left hand on the wheel and his coffee in the right, and he'd had both in the same position since they left the hangar. He'd said 4 things since the award board lit up. 3 of them were directions to the truck, and one of them was to Karnex, standing in the hangar with the 3 category plaques and the special recognition card. You changed the game. Karnex had looked at the card. We did, he said. Mike had nodded and picked up his gear bag. Now the truck ran north on the highway with Lake Superior somewhere to the right in the dark, and the stars were out over the lake, cold and very clear, the kind of sky that only appears in February over water when the temperature has driven all the moisture out of the air. James watched them through the passenger window and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing he could do when he was satisfied. He finished his sandwich, the last one he'd been rationing. Karnex spent his final week in Minnesota, in the forge every morning. Not working on anything large. He came in, put on the apron, swept the floor, and then built small things. Test pieces, short blades, a set of Vorthal patterned tools that he made with the twin hearth and left hanging on the pegboard beside Mike's hammer collection, each one tagged in Vorthal's script. Mike didn't ask what the tags said. On the 4th morning, Karnex sat at the workbench, the new one, the replacement for the one he destroyed in week 3, and spent 2 hours forging a kitchen knife. No alloy additions, no resonance chamber. Propin only, hand hammer, the basic Damascus method Mike had taught him in the first cold weeks of winter. Plain handle from a scrap of the walnut. When it was done, he set it on the cooling rack and etched a sigil into the spine with a fine punch. Small, precise, each mark placed with the concentration he brought to everything. James watched from the entrance, without going in. The sigil, when Karnex was finished, looked like 2 lines meeting at a point, or maybe 2 rivers joining, or 2 fires touching without going out. The Vorthal glyph for shared, the same one Karnex had described weeks ago when talking about what the blade would mean. He set it on the workbench, beside the apprenticeship contract. 12 pages of Terran Vorthal diplomatic agreement that Dr. Salana had spent 3 days drafting, specifying a formal knowledge exchange program between the Vorthal Forge Consortium and the Aldrich Backyard operation, which was the first time in Terran Vorthal relations that a backyard had been named as a party to a diplomatic instrument. Mike had signed it without reading all of it. You going to read the rest? James had asked. I got the important parts, Mike said. He comes back, he teaches, we teach back. Rest is paper. Karnex had signed with the formal Vorthal foremark, a gesture made with the upper right hand, a specific pressure pattern that functioned as a binding seal. And then he had pressed his lower left hand flat to the document for a moment, the way, James realized, he pressed it flat to the table when he was done processing something, when the category had resolved and could be filed. The shuttle to the Vorthal diplomatic transport was scheduled for a Thursday. Karnex loaded his gear the evening before, the resonance components from the twin hearth packed into their original crates, the ceremonial mask in its case, a set of Mike's hand-forged punches that Mike had wrapped in shop cloth and handed him without explanation. Karnex had held them for a moment, looking at them, and said nothing. For when you build the next one, Mike said. Karnex packed them carefully. In the morning at the door of the forge, Karnex stopped. He turned back. He looked at the twin hearth, the hybrid configuration they had burned down twice and rebuilt, the propane firebox on the left and the resonance chamber on the right, the shared wall that they had moved 6 inches to get the venting right, the thing that tells the fire to be quieter, installed at the intake and doing its job. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up the kitchen knife from the workbench, the one with the Vorthal sigil on the spine, and set it on top of the contract. I will return, he said. James was leaning on the truck. We know. Next time I am bringing lunch. James looked at him. You don't eat our food. I will bring my own. That's not really bringing lunch. It is a gesture, Kaarnak said. The gesture is the point. James thought about that. Fair enough, he said. Mike was in the driver's seat already, coffee in hand. He didn't wave. He lifted 2 fingers off the wheel, the way he acknowledged things that didn't require more than that, things that were settled, understood, not in need of ceremony. Kaarnak got in the truck bed. Spring came to the Aldrich backyard in the particular way it comes to Duluth. Slowly, then all at once, the snow pulling back from the south-facing edges of things first, and then retreating everywhere over the course of 2 weeks until the yard was mud and new grass, and the smell of wet soil warming up. James forged alone through April and into May, running the probe inside of the twin hearth, leaving the resonance chamber dormant, but connected. It held charge without power, the violet lens still glowing faintly when he checked it. He made small blades, a set of kitchen knives for a neighbor who'd asked, a paring knife for Dr. Salana, who had, toward the end of the Vorthal mission, become unexpectedly interested in Damascus pattern and had asked 3 questions about it in one afternoon that were better questions than James had expected. He was working a billet one afternoon, in May when the crate arrived. Diplomatic courier, Vorthal origin stamp, his name on the label in both scripts. It was about the size of a shoebox, and it hummed faintly from inside. He opened it on the workbench. Nestled in packing material was a cleaver, broad blade, single bevel. The pattern in the steel, the blue-white of deep ice shot through with dark currents. The Vorthal resonance technique used at its full output without the propin hybrid. The grain running in a pattern he'd never seen before, not Damascus, not the river inside a river of Kamurai, but something new. Something that had learned from both without being either. Under it, a note in Terran, standard, handwritten in the careful block letters of someone for whom the script was a second language. The consortium asks about your technique. I told them they must come to you. They are sending 3 forge masters. They will need aprons. K. Vel. P.S. I am enclosing something for your reference. Under the note, wrapped in the same shop cloth Mike used for his hand tools, a chef's knife. Plain walnut handle. Damascus pattern in the blade, fluid and dark, folded over and over until the grain ran deep. Clean lines, good balance. A Vorthal sigil etched into the spine, not the one that meant shared. A different one. James didn't recognize it. He photographed it and sent it to Kaarnak. The reply came back in 6 minutes. It means Tuesday. James set the knife on the workbench next to the cleaver. He stood there for a moment, looking at both of them. The cleaver throwing its blue-white light at the ceiling. The chef's knife quiet and dark and patient, the pattern moving in it, the way the grain always moved when the light hit folded steel at the right angle. He went back to his billet. The invitation arrived 3 weeks later. A formal Vorthal diplomatic document, gold-sealed, requesting the presence of James Aldrich of Duluth, Minnesota, at the Celestial Craft Convergence on Vorthal, where he would demonstrate the Terran method of Damascus steel, forging to an assembly of the Vorthal Forge Consortium's senior masters. Attached to it in Kaarnak's block letters, I have rebuilt the forge. There is an anvil. It is not as good as your father's. I am working on this. Dr. Salana called within the hour. The Alliance wants to send a full diplomatic team, she said. Sure, James said. This is significant, James. This is the first Terran craft demonstration at a Vorthal formal assembly. The implications for... I know, he said. I'll pack sandwiches. The Celestial Craft Convergence Amphitheater was under a glass canopy that curved 60 feet overhead, and the assembled forge masters of Vorthal numbered 400, and the air inside smelled of minerals and heat, and the particular dryness of a forge that had been running for a very long time. James stood at the back. He'd been here before, Technically, in the cold drop moment that opened this whole story, in the future that was now the present, the loop closing as these things do. But standing here now was different from standing in the diplomatic suite trying to imagine it. The scale of it was real. The weight of 400 Vorthal Forge Masters in concentric arcs was real. The glass canopy, the resonance chimes set into every seat, the stone platform at the center. Kaarnex on the platform, holding Kamurai. James watched from the shadows and ate his sandwich. The peanut butter had gone stiff. The bread was flat on one side from his jacket pocket. It was fine. Pre-climax mundane beat, he straightened the wrapper, folded the corner down, set it in his pocket for later, checked that his translator unit was clipped correctly. It was. Then he looked up. Kaarnex's voice filled the amphitheater on both registers. The words on top, the harmonic underneath, the sound that James now associated with formal address the way he associated his father's voice with the forge. I stood before this consortium 11 months ago. Kaarnex raised Kamurai above his head, the blade catching the glass canopy's filtered light and throwing it back in the grain's two directions. I told you that the methods of the Terran craftsmen were primitive, that their fire was too simple, their tools too crude, their patience accidental. 400 forge masters, not a sound. I was correct about the fire, the tools, the patience. He lowered the blade. He set it flat on the stone platform, and the grain kept moving, slow and dark, each folded layer catching the light in sequence. I was wrong about what those things could make. He looked up at the assembly, all four eyes, front-facing, the full attention position. It is not an alloy, he said. He put his lower left hand flat on the blade. It is a bond. The chimes began, all 400 of them at once, rising from a murmur into something that filled the glass canopy and bounced back down warm and enormous. The Vorthal standing ovation, the resonance of 400 forge masters acknowledging something that had changed what they knew. James stood in the shadows and listened. 3 forge masters in the front arc had already leaned together, speaking in low harmonics. One of them had a data slate out. All 3 of them were looking at Kamurai on the platform, not at Kaarnex, at the blade, with the look that James recognized from the woman in the Duluth hangar and from Kaarnex himself in the display chamber all those months ago. The look of a craftsman, seeing something they don't know how to make yet. They were going to need aprons. After, Kaarnex found him in the corridor outside the amphitheater, a stone passage with Vorthal glyph marks cut into the walls, amber-filled, old. He was carrying something wrapped in shop cloth. James raised an eyebrow. The forge is this way, Kaarnex said. You built it in the temple. In the lower level, there is a room with good ventilation and stone floors. He paused. I checked the ventilation 3 times. Thorough, James said. I also, Kaarnex said, purchased a propane supply from a Terran trade contact. It took 4 months, and the diplomatic team was not helpful. Dr. Salana. She described the acquisition as outside the scope of the exchange program. She's not wrong. Nevertheless, Kaarnex said. He held out the shop cloth. Inside was a set of tongs, hand-forged, Vorthal resonance steel, but shaped in the style of Mike's tongs, the same jaw geometry, the same ring handle. Made from memory, made correctly. James took them. They were well balanced. The metal was still faintly warm. You've been busy, he said. I have been waiting, Kaarnex said. There is a difference. They walked toward the lower level. The stone corridor sloped down, and the air changed, warmer, with the mineral edge of a forge that had been recently lit, and beneath that the smell of propane, familiar and odd in this place at the same time. At the corridor's end, through an open door, the forge. And on the workbench beside it, set plain on the stone surface with no display cloth, no case, no ceremony, a squished peanut butter sandwich. James stopped. Vorthal trade contact again, he said. I specified the type, Karnak said. They did not guarantee the condition. It's squished. Yes. James looked at it. He looked at the forge, propane firebox on the left, a new resonance chamber on the right, the wall between them set 6 inches back from where it would have been wrong. The thing that tells the fire to be quieter, visible at the intake, a Vorthal component in a Terran configuration. The anvil was new. Good tool steel, heavier than Mike's, not as good as Mike's. Karnak had said so in the note, and he was right, and he would work on it. James picked up the sandwich. The bread was flat on both sides. He took a bite. Above the forge complex, through the stone and the rock of the moon's surface and the molten sky above it, the stars turned slowly in the dark. Their light came down through the glass canopy of the amphitheater and fell on the platform where Camurai still rested. Plain handle, clean lines, the grain moving in it, the way grain moves in folded steel when the light hits at the right angle, each layer catching and passing the light along to the next, patient and quiet, and exactly as deep as the work that made it.